Chapter 16 of Work, A Story of Experience. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Bertke. Work, A Story of Experience by Louisa May Alcott, Chapter 16, Mustered In. Christie's return was a very happy one, and could not well be otherwise, with a mother, sister, and lover to welcome her back. Her meeting with Letty was indescribably tender, and the days that followed were pretty equally divided between her and her brother in nursing the one and loving the other. There was no cloud now in Christie's sky, and all the world seemed in bloom. But even while she enjoyed every hour of life and begrudged the time given to sleep, she felt as if the dream was too beautiful to last, and often said, "Something will happen. Such perfect happiness is not possible in this world." "Then let us make the most of it," David would reply, wisely bent on getting his honey while he could, and not borrowing trouble for the morrow. So Christie turned a deaf ear to her prophetic soul, and gave herself up to the blissful holiday that had come at last. Even while March winds were howling outside, she blissfully poked in the dirt with David in the greenhouse, put up the curly lock as often as she liked, and told him she loved him a dozen times a day, not in words, but in silent ways that touched him to the heart and made his future look so bright he hardly dared believe in it. A happier man it would have been difficult to find just then. All his burdens seemed to have fallen off, and his spirits rose again with an elasticity which surprised even those who knew him best. Christie often stopped to watch and wonder if the blithe young man who went whistling and singing about the house, often stopping to kiss somebody, to joke, or to explain with a beaming face like a child at a party, "Isn't everything beautiful?" could be the sober, steady David who used to plod to and fro with his shoulders a little bent, and the absent look in his eyes that told of thoughts above or beyond the daily task. It was good to see his mother rejoice over him with an exceeding great joy. It was better still to see Letty's eyes follow him with unspeakable love and gratitude in their soft depths. But it was best of all to see Christie marvel and exult over the discoveries she made, for, though she had known David for a year, she had never seen the real man till now. "Davy, you are a humbug," she said one day when they were making up a bridal order in the greenhouse. "I told you so, but you wouldn't believe it," he answered, using long-stemmed rosebuds with as prodigal a hand as if the wedding was to be his own. "I thought I was going to marry a quiet, studious, steady-going man, and here I find myself engaged to a romantic youth who flies about in the most undignified manner, embraces people behind doors, sings opera airs, very much out of tune, by the way, and conducts himself more like an infatuated Claude Melnotte than a respectable gentleman on the awful verge of matrimony. Nothing can surprise me now. I'm prepared for anything, even the sight of my Quakerish lover dancing a jig." "Just what I've been longing to do. Come and take a turn, it will do you good." And, to Christie's utter amazement, David caught her round the waist and waltzed her down the boarded walk with a speed and skill that caused less havoc among the flower-pots than one would imagine, and seemed to delight the plants, who rustled and nodded as if applauding the dance of the finest double flower that had ever blossomed in their midst. "I can't help it, Christie," he said, when he had landed her breathless and laughing at the other end. "I feel like a boy out of school, or rather a man out of prison, and must enjoy my liberty in some way. I'm not a talker, you know, and, as the laws of gravitation forbid my soaring aloft anywhere, I can only express my joyfully uplifted state of mind by prancing, as you call it. Never mind dignity. Let's be happy, and by I'll sober down." "I don't want you to. I love to see you so young and happy, only you are not the old David, and I've got to get acquainted with the new one." "I hope you'll like him better than the frost-bitten old David you first knew and were kind enough to love. Mother says I've gone back to the time before we lost Letty, and I sometimes feel as if I had. In that case you will find me a proud, impetuous, ambitious fellow, Christie, and how will that suit?" "Excellently. I like pride of your sort. Impetuosity becomes you, for you have learned to control it if need be, and the ambition is best of all. I always wondered at your want of it, and longed to stir you up, for you did not seem the sort of man to be contented with mere creature comforts when there are so many fine things men may do. What shall you choose, Davy?" "I shall wait for time to show. The sap is all astir in me, and I'm ready for my chance. I don't know what it is, but I feel very sure that some work will be given me into which I can put my whole heart and soul and strength. I spoilt my first chance, but I know I shall have another, and whatever it is, I'm ready to do my best, and live or die for it as God wills." "So am I," answered Christie, with a voice as earnest and a face as full of hopeful resolution as his own. Then they went back to their work, little dreaming as they tied roses and twined smilax wreaths how near that other chance was, how soon they were to be called upon to keep their promise, and how well each was to perform the part given them, in life and death. The gun fired one April morning at Fort Sumter told many men like David what their work was to be, and showed many women like Christie a new right to claim and bravely prove their fitness to possess. No need to repeat the story of the war begun that day. It has been so often told that it will only be touched upon here as one of the experiences of Christie's life, an experience which did for her what it did for all who took a share in it, and loyally acted their part. The North woke up from its prosperous lethargy, and began to stir with the ominous hum of bees when rude hands shake the hive. Rich and poor were proud to prove that they loved their liberty better than their money or their lives, and the descendants of the brave old Puritans were worthy of their race. Many said, "It will soon be over," but the wise men, who had warned in vain, shook their heads as the first disastrous summer showed that the time for compromise was past, and the stern reckoning day of eternal justice was at hand. To no home in the land did the great trouble bring a more sudden change than the little cottage in the lane. All its happy peace was broken. Excitement and anxiety, grief and indignation, banished the sweet home joys and darkened the future that had seemed so clear. David was sober enough now, and went about his work with a grim set to his lips, and a spark in his eyes that made the three women look at one another, pale with unspoken apprehension. As they sat together, picking lint or rolling bandages, while David read aloud some dismal tale of a lost battle that chilled their blood and made their hearts ache with pity, each woman, listening to the voice that stirred her like martial music, said within herself, "Sooner or later he will go, and I will have no right to keep him." Each tried to be ready to make her sacrifice bravely when the time came, and each prayed that it might not be required of her. David said little, but they knew by the way he neglected the garden and worked for the soldiers that his heart was in the war. Day after day he left Christie and his sister to fill orders that came so often now for flowers to lay on the grave of some dear dead boy brought home to his mother in a shroud. Day after day he hurried away to help Mr. Power in the sanitary work that soon claimed all hearts and hands, and, day after day, he came home with what Christie called the heroic look more plainly written on his face. All that first summer, so short and strange, all that first winter, so long and hard to those who went and those who stayed, David worked and waited, and the women waxed strong in the new atmosphere of self-sacrifice which pervaded the air, bringing out the sturdy virtues of the North. "How terrible! Oh, when will it be over?" sighed Letty one day, after hearing a long list of the dead and wounded in one of the great battles of that second summer. "Never till we have beaten," cried David, throwing down the paper and walking about the room with his head up like a war-horse who smells powder. "It is terrible and yet glorious. I thank heaven I lived to see this great wrong righted, and only wish I could do my share like a man." "This is natural, but there are plenty of men who have fewer ties than you, who can fight better, and whose places are easier to fill than yours if they die," said Christie hastily. "But the men who have most to lose fight best, they say, and to my thinking a soldier needs principle as well as a weapon if he is to do real service." "As the only son of a widow you can't be drafted, that's one comfort," said Letty, who could not bear to give up the brother lost to her for so many years. "I should not wait for that, and I know mother would give her widow's mite if she saw that it was needed." "Yes, Davy." The soft old voice answered steadily, but the feeble hand closed instinctively on the arm of her only son, who was so dear to her. David held it close in both of his, saying gratefully, "Thank you, mother." Then fixing his eyes on the younger, yet not dearer women, he added with a ring in his voice that made their hearts answer with a prompt "Aye, aye!" in spite of love or fear, Now listen, you dear souls, and understand that, if I do this thing, I shall not do it hastily, nor without counting well the cost. My first and most natural impulse was to go in the beginning, but I stayed for your sakes. I saw I was not really needed. I thought the war would soon be over, and those who went could do the work. You see how mistaken we were, and God only knows when the end will come. The boys, bless their brave hearts, have done nobly, but older men are needed now. We cannot sacrifice all the gallant lads, and we who have more to lose than they must take our turn and try to do as well. You own this. I see it in your faces. Then don't hold me back when the time comes for me to go. I must do my part, however small it is, or I shall never feel as if I deserved the love you give me. You will let me go, I am sure, and not regret that I did what seemed to me a solemn duty, leaving the consequences to the Lord."
"Yes, David," sister and sweetheart answered, bravely forgetting in the fervor of the moment what heavy consequences God might see fit to send. "Good. I knew my Spartans would be ready, and I won't disgrace them. I've waited more than a year and done what I could, but all the while I felt I was going to get a chance at the hard work, and I've been preparing for it. Bennett will take the garden and the greenhouse off my hands this autumn for a year or longer if I like. He's a kind, neighborly man, and his boy will take my place about the house and protect you faithfully. Mr. Power cannot be spared to go as chaplain, though he longs to desperately. So he is near in case of need, and with your 2 devoted daughters by you, mother, I can surely be spared for a little while." "Only one daughter near her, David. I shall enlist when you do," said Christie resolutely. "You mean it?" "I mean it as honestly as you do. I knew you would go. I saw you getting ready, and I made up my mind to follow. I, too, have prepared for it, and even spoken to Mrs. Amory. She has gone as matron of a hospital, and promised to find a place for me when I was ready. The day you enlist, I shall write and tell her that I am ready." There was a fire in Christie's eyes and a flush on her cheeks now as she stood up with the look of a woman bent on doing well her part. David caught her hands in his, regardless of the ominous bandages they held, and said with tender admiration and reproach in his voice, "You wouldn't marry me when I asked you this summer, fearing you would be a burden to me. But now you want to share the hardship and danger with me and support me by the knowledge of your nearness. Dear, ought I to let you do it?" "You will let me do it, and in return I will marry you whenever you ask me," answered Christie, sealing the promise with a kiss that silenced him. He had been anxious to be married long ago, but when he asked Mr. Power to make him happy, a month after his engagement, that wise friend said to him, "I don't advise it yet. You have tried and proved one another as friends, now try and prove one another as lovers. Then, if you feel that all is safe and happy, you will be ready for the greatest of the 3 experiments, and then in God's name marry." "We will," they said, and for a year had been content, studying one another, finding much to love, and something to learn in the art of bearing and forbearing. David had begun to think that they had waited long enough, but Christie still delayed, fearing that she was not worthy, and secretly afflicted by the thought of her poverty. She had so little to give in return for all she had received that it troubled her, and she was sometimes tempted to ask Uncle Enos for a modest marriage portion. She never had yet, and now resolved to ask nothing, but to earn her blessing by doing her share in the great work. "I shall remember that," was all David answered to that last promise of hers, and 3 months later he took her at her word. For a week or 2 they went on in the old way. Christie did her housework with her head full of new plans, read books on nursing, made gruel, plasters, and poultices, till Mrs. Sterling pronounced her perfect, and dreamed dreams of a happy time to come when peace had returned, and David was safe at home with all the stars and bars a man could win without dying for them. David set things in order, conferred with Bennett, petted his womankind, and then hurried away to pack boxes of stores, visit camps, and watch departing regiments with daily increasing certainty that his time had come. One September day he went slowly home and, seeing Christie in the garden, joined her, helped her finish matting up some delicate shrubs, put by the tools, and when all was done, said with unusual gentleness, "Come and walk a little in the lane." She put her arm in his and answered quickly, "You've something to tell me. I see it in your face." "Dear, I must go." "Yes, David." "And you?" I go too. Yes, Christie. That was all. She did not offer to detain him now. He did not deny her right to follow. They looked each other bravely in the face a moment, seeing, acknowledging the duty and the danger, yet ready to do the one and dare the other, since they went together. Then, shoulder to shoulder, as if already mustered in, these faithful comrades marched to and fro, planning their campaign. Next evening, as Mrs. Sterling sat alone in the twilight, a tall man in army blue entered quietly, stood watching the tranquil figure for a moment, then went and knelt down beside it, saying, with a most unsoldierly choke in the voice, "I've done it, Mother. Tell me you're not sorry." But the little Quaker cap went down on the broad shoulder, and the only answer he heard was a sob that stirred the soft folds over the tender old heart that clung so closely to the son who had lived for her so long. What happened in the twilight no one ever knew, but David received promotion for bravery in a harder battle than any he was going to, and from his mother's breast a decoration more precious to him than the cross of the Legion of Honor from a royal hand. When Mr. Power presently came in, followed by the others, they found their soldier standing very erect in his old place on the rug, with the firelight gleaming on his bright buttons, and Brand staring at him with a perplexed aspect, for the uniform, shorn hair, trimmed beard, and a certain lofty carriage of the head so changed his master that the sagacious beast was disturbed. Letty smiled at him approvingly, then went to comfort her mother, who could not recover her tranquillity so soon. But Christie stood aloof, looking at her lover with something more than admiration in the face that kindled beautifully as she exclaimed, "Oh, David, you are splendid! Once I was so blind I thought you plain, but now my boy in blue is the noblest-looking man I ever saw. Yes, Mr. Power, I've found my hero at last. Here he is, my knight without reproach or fear, going out to take his part in the grandest battle ever fought. I wouldn't keep him if I could, and I'm glad and proud to have him go, and if he never should come back to me, I can bear it better for knowing that he dutifully did his best, and left the consequences to the Lord." Then, having poured out the love and pride and confidence that enriched her sacrifice, she broke down and clung to him, weeping as so many clung and wept in those hard days when men and women gave their dearest, and those who prayed and waited suffered almost as much as those who fought and died. When the deed was once done, it was astonishing what satisfaction they all took in it, how soon they got accustomed to the change, and what pride they felt in "our soldier." The loyal frenzy fell upon the three quiet women, and they could not do too much for their country. Mrs. Sterling cut up her treasured old linen without a murmur. Letty made comfort bags by the dozen, put up jelly, and sewed on blue jackets with tireless industry, while Christie proclaimed that if she had 20 lovers she would send them all, and then made preparations enough to nurse the entire party. David, meantime, was in camp, getting his first taste of martial life, and not liking it any better than he thought he should, but no one heard a complaint, and he never regretted his love amongst the roses, for he was one of the men who had a principle as well as a weapon, and meant to do good service with both. It would have taken many knapsacks to hold all the gifts showered upon him by his friends and neighbors. He accepted all that came, and furnished forth those of his company who were less favored. Among these was Elisha Wilkins, and how he got there should be told. Elisha had not the slightest intention of enlisting, but Mrs. Wilkins was a loyal soul, and could not rest till she had sent a substitute, since she could not go herself. Finding that Elisha showed little enthusiasm on the subject, she tried to rouse him by patriotic appeals of various sorts. She read stirring accounts of battles, carefully omitting the dead and wounded. She turned out, baby and all if possible, to cheer every regiment that left, and was never tired of telling Wash how she wished she could add 10 years to his age and send him off to fight for his country like a man. But nothing seemed to rouse the supine Elisha, who chewed his quid like a placid beast of the field, and showed no sign of a proper spirit. "Very well," said Mrs. Wilkins resolutely to herself, "if I can't make no impression on his soul, I will on his stomach, and see how that'll work." Which threat she carried out with such skill and force that Elisha was effectually waked up, for he was partial to good victuals, and Cynthia was a capital cook. Poor rations did not suit him, and he demanded why his favourite dishes were not forthcoming. "We can't afford no nice victuals now when our men are suffering so. I should be ashamed to cook 'em and expect to choke trying to eat 'em. Everyone is sacrificing something, and we mustn't be slack in doing our part. The Lord knows it's precious little, and there won't be no stuffing in this house for a considerable spell. If I could save up enough to send a man to do my share of the fighting, I should be proud to do it. Anyway, I shall stint the family and send them dear brave fellers every cent I can get without starving the children." "Now, Cynthia, don't be farce. Things will come out all right, and it ain't no use upsetting everything and being so darned uncomfortable," said Mr. Wilkins with unusual energy. "Yes, it is, Lisha. No one has a right to be comfortable in such times as these, and this family ain't going to be if I can help it." And Mrs. Wilkins set down her flat iron with a slam which plainly told her Lisha war was declared. He said no more, but fell a-thinking. He was not as unmoved as he seemed by the general excitement, and had felt sundry manly impulses to up and at 'em when his comrades in the shop discussed the crisis with ireful brandishing of awls and vengeful pounding of sole leather, as if the rebels were under the hammer. But the selfish, slothful little man could not make up his mind to brave hardship and danger, and fell back on his duty to his family as a reason for keeping him safe at home. But now that home was no longer comfortable, now that Cynthia had sharpened her tongue and turned to farce, and now, hardest blow of all, that he was kept on short commons, he began thinking he might as well be on the tented field and get a little glory along with the discomfort if that was inevitable. Nature abhors a vacuum, and when food fell short, patriotism had a chance to fill the aching void. Lisha had about made up his mind, for he knew the value of peace and quietness, and, though his wife was no scold, she was the ruling power, and in his secret soul he considered her a very remarkable woman. He knew what she wanted, but was not going to be hurried by anybody, so he still kept silent, and Mrs. Wilkins began to think she must give it up. An unexpected ally appeared, however, and the good woman took advantage of it to strike one last blow. Lisha sat eating a late breakfast one morning, with a small son at either elbow, waiting for stray mouthfuls and committing petty larcenies right and left, for Pa was in a brown study. Mrs. Wilkins was frying flapjacks, and though this is not considered an heroical employment, she made it so that day. This was a favourite dish of Lisha's, and she had prepared it as a bait for this cautious fish. To say that the fish rose at once and swallowed the bait, hook and all, but feebly expresses the justice done to the cakes by that long-suffering man. Waiting till he had a tempting pile of the lightest, brownest flapjacks ever seen upon his plate, and was watching an extra big bit of butter melt luxuriously into the warm bosom of the upper one, with a face as benign as if some of the molasses he was trickling over them had been absorbed into his nature, Mrs. Wilkins seized the propitious moment to say, impressively, "David Sterling has enlisted." "Sure, has he, though?" "Of course he has. Any man with the spirit of a musketeer would." "Well, he ain't got a family, you see." "He's got his old mither and that sister home from furrin parts somewheres, and Christie's just going to be married. I should like to know who's got a harder family to leave than that." "6 young children is harder. If I went fifing and drumming off, who'd take care of them, I'd like to know." "I guess I could support the family if I give my mind to it," and Mrs. Wilkins turned to Flapjack with an emphasis that caused her lord to bolt a hot triangle with dangerous rapidity, for well he knew very little of his money went to the common purse. She never reproached him, but the fact nettled him now, and something in the tone of her voice made that sweet morsel hard to swallow. "'Pears to me you're in rather a hurry to be a widder, Cynthia, shoving me off to get shot in this kind of a way," growled Lisha, ill at ease. "I'd rather be a brave man's widder than a coward's wife any day," cried the rebellious Cynthia. Then she relented, and softly slid 2 hot cakes into his plate, adding, with her hand upon his shoulder, "Lisha, dear, I want to be proud of my husband as any other woman be of theirs. Every one gives something. I've only got you, and I want to do my share, and do it hearty." She went back to work, and Mr. Wilkins sat thoughtfully stroking the curly heads beside him, while the boys ravaged his plate, with no reproof, but a half-audible, "My little chaps, my little chaps." She thought she had got him, and smiled to herself, even as a great tear sputtered on the griddle at those last words of his. Imagine her dismay when, having consumed the bait, her fish gave signs of breaking the line and escaping after all, for Mr. Wilkins pushed back his chair and said slowly as he filled his pipe, "I'm blessed if I can see the sense of a lot of decent men going off to be froze and starved and blowed up just for them confounded niggers." He got no further, for his wife's patience gave out, and, leaving her cakes to burn black, she turned on him with a face glowing like her stove, and cried out, "Lisha, ain't you got no heart? Can you remember what Hepsy told us, and call them poor, long-suffering creeturs names? Can you think of them wretched wives sold from their husbands, them children as clear as ourn torn from their mothers, and old folks kept slavin' 80 long hard years with no pay, no help, no pity when they get past work? Lisha Wilkins, look at that, and say no if you darst." Mrs. Wilkins was a homely woman in an old calico gown, but her face, her voice, her attitude were grand, as she flung the wide door of the little back bedroom and pointed with her tin spatula to the sight beyond. Only Hepsy, sitting by a bed where lay what looked more like a shriveled mummy than a woman. Ah, but it was that old mother worked and waited for so long, blind now, and deaf, childish, and half dead with many hardships, but safe and free at last, and Hepsy's black face was full of a pride, a peace, and happiness more eloquent and touching than any speech or sermon ever uttered. Mr. Wilkins had heard her story, and been more affected by it than he would confess. Now it came home to him with sudden force. The thought of his own mother, wife, or babies torn from him stirred him to the heart, and the manliest emotion he had ever known caused him to cast his pipe at his feet, put on his hat with an energetic slap, and walk out of the house, wearing an expression on his usually wooden face that caused his wife to clap her hands and cry out exultingly, "I thought that would fetch him." Then she fell to work like an inspired woman, and at noon a scrumptious dinner smoked upon the board, the children were scrubbed till their faces shone, and the room was as fresh and neat as any apartment could be, with the penetrating perfume of burnt flapjacks still pervading the air, and 3 dozen ruffled nightcaps decorating the clothesline overhead. "Tell me the instant you see Pa comin', and I'll dish up the gravy," was Mrs. Wilkins' command, as she stepped in with a cup of tea for Old Harm, as she called Hempsy's mother. "He's a-comin', Ma," called Gusty presently. "No, he ain't. It's a trainer," added Ann Lizzie. "Yes, 'tis Pa. Oh, my eye! Ain't he stunnin'?" cried Wash, stricken for the first time with admiration of his sire. Before Mrs. Wilkins could reply to these conflicting rumors, her husband walked in, looking as martial as his hollow chest and thin legs permitted, and, turning his cap nervously in his hand, said half proudly, half reproachfully, "Now, Cynthia, be you satisfied?" "Oh, my Lisha, I be," and the inconsistent woman fell upon his buttony breast, weeping copiously. If ever a man was praised and petted, admired and caressed, it was Elisha Wilkins that day. His wife fed him with the fat of the land, regardless of consequences. His children revolved about him with tireless curiosity and wonder. His neighbors flocked in to applaud, advise, and admire. Every one treated him with a respect most grateful to his feelings. He was an object of interest, and with every hour his importance increased, so that by night he felt like a commander-in-chief, and bore himself accordingly. He had enlisted in David's regiment, which was a great comfort to his wife. For, though her stout heart never failed her, it grew very heavy at times, and when Lisha was gone she often dropped a private tear over the broken pipe that always lay in its old place, and vented her emotions by sending baskets of nourishment to Private Wilkins, which caused that bandy-legged warrior to be much envied and cherished by his mates. "I'm glad I done it, for it will make a man of Lisha, and, if I've sent him to his death, God knows he'll be fitter to die than if he stayed here idling his life away." Then the good soul openly shouldered the burden she had borne so long in secret, and bravely trudged on alone. "Another great battle!" screamed the excited newsboys in the streets. "Another great battle!" read Letty in the college parlor. "Another great battle!" cried David, coming in with the war-horse expression on his face a month or two after he enlisted. The women dropped their work to look and listen, for his visits were few and short, and every instant was precious. When the first greetings were over, David stood silent an instant, and a sudden mist came over his eyes as he glanced from one beloved face to another. Then he threw back his head with the old impatient gesture, squared his shoulders, and said in a loud, cheerful voice, with a suspicious undertone of emotion in it, however, "My precious people, I've got something to tell you. Are you ready?" They knew what it was without a word. Mrs. Sterling clasped her hands and bowed her head. Letty turned pale and dropped her work, but Christie's eyes kindled, and she answered with a salute. "Ready, my general!" "We are ordered off at once, and go at 4 this afternoon. I've got a 3 hours' leave to say good-bye in. Now let's be brave, and enjoy every minute of it." "We will. What can I do for you, Davy?" asked Christie, wonderfully supported by the thought that she was going too. "Keep your promise, dear," he answered, while the warlike expression changed to one of infinite tenderness. "What promise?" "This," and he held out his hand with a little paper in it. She saw it was a marriage license, and on it lay a wedding ring. She did not hesitate an instant, but laid her own hand in his, and answered with her heart in her face, "I'll keep it, David." "I knew you would." Then holding her close, he said in a tone that made it very hard for her to keep steady, as she vowed she would do to the last, "I know it is much to ask, but I want to feel that you are mine before I go. Not only that, but it will be a help and a protection to you, dear, when you follow. As a married woman you will get on better. As my wife you will be allowed to come to me if I need you, and as my—" He stopped here, for he could not add, "As my widow you will have my pension to support you." She understood, put both arms about his neck as if to keep him safe, and whispered fervently, "Nothing can part us any more, not even death, for love like ours will last forever." "Then you are quite willing to try the third great experiment?" "Glad and proud to do it, with no doubt, no fear to mar your consent." "Not one, David." "That's true love, Christie." Then they stood quite still for a time, and in the silence the two hearts talked together in the sweet language no tongue can utter. Presently David said regretfully, "I meant it should be so different. I always planned that we'd be married some bright summer day with many friends about us, then take a happy little journey somewhere together, and come back to settle down at home in the dear old way. Now it's all so hurried, sorrowful, and strange. A dull November day, no friends but Mr. Power, who will be here soon, no journey but my march to Washington alone, and no happy coming home together in this world, perhaps. Can you bear it, love?" "Have no fear for me. I feel as if I could bear anything just now, for I've got into a heroic mood, and I mean to keep so as long as I can. I've always wanted to live in stirring times, to have a part in great deeds, to sacrifice and suffer something for a principle or a person, and now I have my wish. I like it, David. It's a grand time to live, a splendid chance to do and suffer, and I want to be in it heart and soul, and earn a little of the glory or the martyrdom that will come in the end. Surely I shall, if I give you and myself to the cause, and I do it gladly, though I know that my heart has got to ache as it never has ached yet, when my courage fails, as it will by and by, and my selfish soul counts the cost of my offering after the excitement is over. Help me to be brave and strong, David. Don't let me complain or regret, but show me what lies beyond, and teach me to believe that simply doing the right is reward and happiness enough." Christie was lifted out of herself for the moment, and looked inspired by the high mood which was but the beginning of a nobler life for her. David caught the exaltation, and gave no further thought to anything but the duty of the hour, finding himself stronger and braver for that long look into the illuminated face of the woman he loved. "I'll try," was all his answer to her appeal, then proved that he meant it by adding, with his lips against her cheek, "I must go to Mother and Letty. We leave them behind, and they must be comforted." He went, and Christie vanished to make ready for her wedding, conscious, in spite of her exalted state of mind, that everything was very hurried, sad, and strange, and very different from the happy day she had so often planned. "No matter, we are well on for love, and that is really all we need," she thought, recalling with a smile Mrs. Wilkins's advice. "David sends you these, dear. Can I help in any way?" asked Letty, coming with a cluster of lovely white roses in her hand, and a world of affection in her eyes. "I thought he'd give me violets." And a shadow came over Christie's face. "But they are morning flowers, you know." "Not to me. The roses are, for they remind me of poor Helen, and the first work I did with David was arranging flowers like these for a dead baby's little coffin." "My dearest Christie, don't be superstitious. All brides wear roses, and Davy thought you'd like them," said Letty, troubled at her words. "Then I'll wear them, and I won't have fancies if I can help it. But I think few brides dress with a braver, happier heart than mine, though I do choose a sober wedding gown," answered Christie, smiling again, as she took from a half-packed trunk her new hospital suit of soft grey woolen stuff. "Won't you wear the pretty silvery silk we like so well?" Letty asked timidly, for something in Christie's face and manner impressed her very much. "No. I will be married in my uniform, as David is," she answered, with a look Letty long remembered. "Mr. Power has come," she said softly a few minutes later, with an anxious glance at the clock. "Go, dear, I'll come directly. But first," and Christie held her friend close a moment, kissed her tenderly, and whispered in a broken voice, "Remember, I don't take his heart from you. I only share it with my sister and my mother." "I'm glad to give him to you, Christie, for now I feel as if I had partly paid the great debt I've owed so long," answered Letty through her tears. Then she went away, and Christie soon followed, looking very like a Quaker bride in her grey gown with no ornament but delicate frills at her wrist and the roses in her bosom. "No bridal white, dear," said David, going to her. "Only this," and she touched the flowers, adding, with her hand on the blue coat-sleeve that embraced her, "I want to consecrate my uniform as you do yours by being married in it. Isn't it fitter for a soldier's wife than lace and silk at such a time as this?" "Much fitter. I like it, and I find you beautiful, my Christie," whispered David as he put one of her roses in his buttonhole. "Then I'm satisfied." "Mr. Power is waiting. Are you ready, love?" "Quite ready." Then they were married, with Letty and her mother standing beside them, Bennet and his wife dimly visible in the doorway, and poor Bran at his master's feet, looking up with wistful eyes, half human in the anxious affection they expressed. Christie never forgot that service, so simple, sweet, and solemn, nor the look her husband gave her at the end, when he kissed her on the lips and forehead, saying fervently, "God bless my wife." A tender little scene followed that can be better imagined than described. Then Mr. Power said cheerfully, "1 hour more is all you have, so make the most of it, dearly beloved. You young folks take a wedding trip to the greenhouse, while we see how well we can get on without you." Then they were married. David and Christie went smiling away together, and if they shed any tears over the brief happiness, no one saw them but the flowers, and they loyally kept the secret folded up in their tender hearts. Mr. Power cheered the old lady, while Letty, always glad to serve, made ready the last meal David might ever take at home. A very simple little marriage feast, but more love, good-will, and tender wishes adorned the plain table than is often found at wedding breakfasts. And better than any speech or song was Letty's broken whisper, as she folded her arms round David's empty chair when no one saw her, "Heaven bless and keep and bring him back to us." How time went that day! The inexorable clock would strike 12 so soon, and then the minutes flew till 1 was at hand, and the last words were still half said, the last good-byes still unuttered. "I must go," cried David, with a sort of desperation, as Letty clung to one arm, Christie to the other. "I shall see you soon. Good-bye, my husband," whispered Christie, setting him free. "Give the last kiss to mother," added Letty, following her example, and in another minute David was gone. At the turn of the lane he looked back and swung his cap. All waved their hands to him, and then he marched away to the great work before him, leaving those loving hearts to ask the unanswerable question, "How will he come home?" Christie was going to town to see the regiment off, and soon followed with Mr. Power. They went early to a certain favourable spot, and there found Mrs. Wilkins with her entire family perched upon a fence, on the spikes of which they impaled themselves at intervals, and had to be plucked off by the stout girl engaged to assist in this memorable expedition. "Yes, Lisha's a-goin', and I was bound he should see every one of his blessed children the last thing, if I took 'em all on my back. He knows where to look, and he's a-goin' to see 7 cheerful faces as he goes by. Time enough to cry by me by, so set steady, boys, and cheer loud when you see Pa," said Mrs. Wilkins, fanning her hot face, and utterly forgetting her cherished bonnet in the excitement of the moment. "I hear drums! They're coming!" cried Wash, after a long half-hour's waiting had nearly driven him frantic. The two younger boys immediately tumbled off the fence, and were with difficulty restored to their perches. Gusty began to cry, Annalise to wave a minute red cotton handkerchief, and Adelaide to kick delightedly in her mother's arms. "Jane Carter, take this child for massy's sake. My legs do tremble so I can't hist her another minute. Hold on to me behind somebody, for I must see if I do pitch into the gutter," cried Mrs. Wilkins with a gasp as she wiped her eyes on her shawl, clutched the railing, and stood ready to cheer bravely when her conquering hero came. Wash had heard the drums every 5 minutes since he arrived, but this time he was right, and began to cheer the instant a red cockade appeared at the other end of the long street. It was a different scene now than in the first enthusiastic, hopeful days. Young men and ardent boys filled the ranks then, brave by instinct, burning with loyal zeal, and blissfully ignorant of all that lay before them. Now the blue coats were worn by mature men, some grey, all grave and resolute, husbands and fathers with the memory of wives and children tugging at their heartstrings, homes left desolate behind them, and all before them the grim certainty of danger, hardship, and perhaps a captivity worse than death. Little of the glamour of romance about the war now. They saw what it was, a long, hard task, and here were the men to do it well. Even the lookers-on were different. Once all was wild enthusiasm and glad uproar. Now men's lips were set, and women's smileless, even as they cheered. Fewer handkerchiefs whitened the air, for wet eyes needed them, and sudden lulls, almost solemn in their stillness, followed the acclamations of the crowd. All watched with quickened breath, and proud souls that living wave, blue below and bright with a steely glitter above, as it flowed down the street and away to join the sea of dauntless hearts that for months had rolled up against the south, and ebbed back reddened with the blood of men like these. As the inspiring music, the grand tramp drew near, Christie felt the old thrill and longed to fall in and follow the flag anywhere. Then she saw David, and the regiment became one man to her. He was pale, but his eyes shone, and his whole face expressed that two of the best and bravest emotions of a man, love and loyalty, were at their height as he gave his new-made wife a long, lingering look that seemed to say, "I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honour more." Christie smiled and waved her hand to him, showed him his wedding roses still on her breast, and bore up as gallantly as he, resolved that his last impression of her should be a cheerful one. But when it was all over, and nothing remained but the trampled street, the hurrying crowd, the bleak November sky, when Mrs. Wilkins sat sobbing on the steps like Niobe, with her children scattered about her, then Christie's heart gave way, and she hid her face on Mr. Power's shoulder for a moment, all her ardour quenched in tears as she cried within herself, "No, I could not bear it if I was not going to." End of Chapter 10. Recording by Mary Bertke, Columbus, Ohio, proprietor of DreamweaverBraiding.com.
Chapter 17 of Work, A Story of Experience. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Lee Paquet. Work, A Story of Experience by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 17, The Colonel. 10 years earlier, Christie made her debut as an Amazon. Now she had a braver part to play on a larger stage, with a nation for audience, martial music, and the boom of cannon for orchestra. The glare of battlefields was the red light, danger, disease, and death the foes she was to contend against, and the troop she joined, not timid girls, but high-hearted women, who fought gallantly till the demon lay dead, and sang their song of exultation with bleeding hearts, for this great spectacle was a dire tragedy to them. Christie followed David in a week, and soon proved herself so capable that Mrs. Amory rapidly promoted her from one important post to another, and bestowed upon her the only honors left the women, hard work, responsibility, and the gratitude of many men. "You are a treasure, my dear, for you can turn your hand to anything and do well whatever you undertake. So many come with plenty of goodwill, but not a particle of practical ability, and are offended because I decline their help. The boys don't want to be cried over or have their brows everlastingly swabbed, as old Watkins calls it. They want to be well fed and nursed, and cheered up with creature comforts. Your nice beef tea and cheery ways are worth oceans of tears and cartloads of tracts." Mrs. Amory said this, as Christie stood waiting while she wrote an order for some extra delicacy for a very sick patient. Mrs. Sterling, Jr., certainly did look like an efficient nurse who thought more of the boys than of herself, for one hand bore a pitcher of gruel, the other a bag of oranges, clean shirts hung over the right arm, a rubber cushion under the left, and every pocket in the big apron was full of bottles and bandages, papers and letters. "I never discovered what an accomplished woman I was till I came here," answered Christie, laughing. "I'm getting vain with so much praise, but I like it immensely, and never was so pleased in my life as I was yesterday when Dr. Harvey came for me to take care of poor Dunbar, because no one else could manage him. It's your firm yet pitiful way the men like so well. I can't describe it better than in Big Ben's words. 'Miss Sterling is the nurse for me, ma'am. She takes care of me as if she was my own mother, and it's a comfort just to see her round.' It's a gift, my dear, and you may thank heaven you have got it, for it works wonders in a place like this. I only treat the poor fellows as I would have other women treat my David if he should be in their care. He may be any hour, you know. And my boys, God keep them." The pen lay idle, and the gruel cooled, as young wife and gray-haired mother forgot their duty for a moment in tender thoughts of the absent. Only a moment, for in came an attendant with a troubled face, and an important young surgeon with the well-worn little case under his arm. "Bartlett's dying, marm. Could you come and see to him?" says the man to Mrs. Amory. "We have got to amputate Porter's arm this morning, and he won't consent unless you are with him. You will come, of course," added the surgeon to Christie, having tried and found her a woman with no confounded nerves to impair her usefulness. So matron and nurse go back to their duty, and dying Bartlett and suffering Porter are all the more tenderly served for that wasted minute. Like David, Christie had enlisted for the war, and in the 2 years that followed she saw all sorts of service, for Mrs. Amory had influence, and her right-hand woman, after a few months' apprenticeship, was ready for any post. The gray gown and comforting face were known in many hospitals, seen on crowded transports, among the ambulances at the front, invalid cars, relief tents, and food depots up and down the land, and many men went out of life like tired children holding the hand that did its work so well. David, meanwhile, was doing his part manfully, not only in some of the great battles of those years, but among the hardships, temptations, and sacrifices of a soldier's life. Spite of his Quaker ancestors, he was a good fighter, and better still, a magnanimous enemy, hating slavery but not the slaveholder, and often spared the master while he saved the chattel. He was soon promoted, and might have risen rapidly, but was content to remain as captain of his company, for his men loved him, and he was prouder of his influence over them than of any decoration he could win. His was the sort of courage that keeps a man faithful to death, and though he made no brilliant charge, uttered few protestations of loyalty, and was never heard to damn the Rebs, his comrades felt that his brave example had often kept them steady, till a forlorn hope turned into a victory, knew that all the wealth of the world could not bribe him from his duty, and learned of him to treat with respect an enemy as brave and less fortunate than themselves. A noble nature soon takes its proper rank, and exerts its purifying influence, and Private Sterling won confidence, affection, and respect, long before promotion came; for though he had tended his flowers like a woman, and loved his books like a student, he now proved that he could also do his duty and keep his honor stainless as a soldier and a gentleman. He and Christie met as often as the one could get a brief furlough, or the other could be spared from hospital duty. But when these meetings did come, they were wonderfully beautiful and rich, for into them was distilled a concentration of the love, happiness, and communion which many men and women only know through years of wedded life. Christie liked romance, and now she had it, with a very sombre reality to give it an added charm. No Juliet ever welcomed her Romeo more joyfully than she welcomed David when he paid her a flying visit unexpectedly. No Bayard ever had a more devoted lady in his tent than David, when his wife came through every obstacle to bring him comforts, or to nurse the few wounds he received. Love letters, written beside watch-fires and sick-beds, flew to and fro like carrier doves with wondrous speed; and nowhere in all the brave and busy land was there a fonder pair than this, although their honeymoon was spent apart in camp and hospital, and well they knew that there might never be for them a happy going home together. In her wanderings to and fro, Christie not only made many new friends, but met some old ones, and among these one whose unexpected appearance much surprised and touched her. She was scrabbling eggs in a tin basin on board a crowded transport, going up the river with the echoes of a battle dying away behind her, and before her the prospect of passing the next day on a wharf serving out food to the wounded in an easterly storm. "Oh, Mrs. Sterling, do go up and see what's to be done. We are all full below, and more poor fellows are lying about on deck in a dreadful state. I'll take your place here, but I can't stand that any longer," said one of her aides, coming in heartsick and exhausted by the ghastly sights and terrible confusion of the day. "I'll go. Keep scrabbling while the eggs last, then knock out the head of that barrel and make gruel till I pass the word to stop." Forgetting her bonnet, and tying the ends of her shawl behind her, Christie caught up a bottle of brandy and a canteen of water, and ran on deck. There a sight to daunt most any woman met her eyes; for all about her, so thick that she could hardly step without treading on them, lay the sad wrecks of men, some moaning for help, some silent, with set white faces turned up to the gray sky, all shelterless from the cold wind that blew, and the fog rising from the river. Surgeons and nurses were doing their best, but the boat was loaded, and greater suffering reigned below. "Heaven help us all!" sighed Christie, and then she fell to work. Bottle and canteen were both nearly empty by the time she came to the end of the long line, where lay a silent figure with a hidden face. "Poor fellow, is he dead?" she said, kneeling down to lift a corner of the blanket lent by a neighbor. A familiar face looked up at her, and a well-remembered voice said courteously but feebly, "Thanks, not yet. Excuse my left hand. I'm very glad to see you." "Mr. Fletcher, can it be you?" she cried, looking at him with pitiful amazement. Well she might ask, for anything more unlike his former self can hardly be imagined. Unshaven, haggard, and begrimed with powder, mud to the knees, coat half on, and, worst of all, the right arm gone, there lay the piece of elegance she had known, and answered with a smile she never saw before. "All that's left of me, and very much at your service. I must apologize for the dirt, but I've laid in a mud puddle for 2 days, and though it was much easier than aboard, it doesn't improve one's appearance." "What can I do for you? Where can I put you? I can't bear to see you here," said Christie, much afflicted by the spectacle before her. "Why not?
We are all alike when it comes to this pass. I shall do very well if I might trouble you for a draught of water."
She poured her last drop into his parched mouth, and hurried off for more. She was detained by the way, and when she returned, fancied he was asleep, but soon discovered that he had fainted quietly away, utterly spent with 2 days of hunger, suffering, and exposure. He was himself again directly, and lay contentedly looking up at her as she fed him with hot soup, longing to talk, but refusing to listen to a word till he was refreshed.
"That's very nice,"
he said gratefully, as he finished, adding with a pathetic sort of gaiety, as he groped about with his one hand,
"I don't expect napkins, but I should like a handkerchief. They took my coat off when they did my arm, and the gentleman who kindly lent me this doesn't seem to have possessed such an article."
Christie wiped his lips with the clean towel at her side, and smiled as she did it, at the idea of Mr. Fletcher's praising burnt soup, and her feeding him like a baby out of a tin cup. "I think it would comfort you if I washed your face. Can you bear to have it done?" she asked.
"If you can bear to do it," he answered, with an apologetic look, evidently troubled at receiving such services from her.
Yet, as her hands moved gently about his face, he shut his eyes, and there was a little quiver of the lips now and then, as he was remembering a time when he had hoped to have her near him in a tenderer capacity than that of nurse. She guessed the thought, and tried to banish it by saying cheerfully as she finished, "There, you look more like yourself after that. Now the hands."
"Fortunately for you, there is but one,"
and he rather reluctantly surrendered a very dirty member. "Forgive me, I forgot. It is a brave hand, and I am proud to wash it."
"How do you know that?"
he asked, surprised at her little burst of enthusiasm, for as she spoke she pressed the grimy hand in both her own. "While I was recovering you from your faint, that man over there informed me that you were his colonel; that you fit like a tiger, and when your right arm was disabled, you took your sword in the left, and cheered them on as if you were bound to beat the whole rebel army."
"That's Drake's story,"
and Mr. Fletcher tried to give the old shrug, but gave an irrepressible groan instead, then endeavored to cover it, by saying in a careless tone,
"I thought I might get a little excitement out of it, so I went soldiering, like all the rest of you. I'm not good for much, but I can lead the way for the brave fellows who do the work. Officers make good targets, and a rebel bullet would cause no sorrow in taking me out of the world."
"Don't say that. I should grieve sincerely, and yet I'm very glad you came, for it will always be a satisfaction to you in spite of your great loss."
"There are greater losses than right arms,"
muttered Mr. Fletcher gloomily, then checked himself, and added with a pleasant change in voice and face, as he glanced at the wedding ring she wore,
"This is not exactly the place for congratulations, but I can't help offering mine; for if I'm not mistaken, your left hand also has grown doubly precious since we met."
Christie had been wondering if he knew, and was much relieved to find he took it so well. Her face said more than her words, as she answered briefly, "Thank you, yes, we were married the day David left, and have both been in the ranks ever since."
"Not wounded yet? Your husband, I mean," he said, getting over the hard words bravely.
"3 times, but not badly. I think a special angel stands before him with a shield," and Christie smiled as she spoke.
"I think a special angel stands behind him with prayers that avail much," added Mr. Fletcher, looking up at her with an expression of reverence that touched her heart.
"Now I must go to my work, and you to sleep. You need all the rest you can get before you have to knock about in the ambulances again," she said, marking the feverish color in his face, and knowing well that excitement was his only strength.
"How can I sleep in such an inferno as this?"
"Try. You are so weak, you'll soon drop off. and laying the cool tips of her fingers on his eyelids, she kept them shut till he yielded with a long sigh of mingled weariness and pleasure, and was asleep before he knew it. When he woke it was late at night, but little of night's blessed rest was known on board that boat laden with a freight of suffering. Cries still came up from below, and moans of pain still sounded from the deck, where shadowy figures with lanterns went to and fro among the beds that in the darkness looked like graves. Weak with pain and fever, the poor man gazed about him half bewildered, and conscious only of one desire, feebly called, "Christie!" "Here I am," and the dull light of a lantern showed him her face very worn and tired, but full of friendliest compassion. "What can I do for you?" she asked, as he clutched her gown, and peered up at her with mingled doubt and satisfaction in his haggard eyes.
"Just speak to me. Let me touch you. I thought it was a dream. Thank God it isn't. How much longer will this last?" he added, falling back on the softest pillows she could find for him.
"We shall soon land now. I believe there is an officers' hospital in town, and you will be quite comfortable there."
"I want to go to your hospital. Where is it?"
"I have none, and unless the old hotel is ready, I shall stay on the wharf with the boys until it is."
"Then I shall stay also. Don't send me away, Christie. I shall not be a trouble long. Surely David will let you help me die."
And poor Fletcher stretched his one hand imploringly to her in the first terror of the delirium that was coming on. "I will not leave you. I'll take care of you, and no one can forbid it. Drink this, Philip, and trust to Christie." He obeyed like a child, and soon fell again into a troubled sleep while she sat by him thinking about David. The old hotel was ready, but by the time he got there Mr. Fletcher was past caring where he went, and for a week was too ill to know anything, except that Christie nursed him. Then he turned the corner and began to recover. She wanted him to go into more comfortable quarters, but he would not stir as long as she remained. So she put him in a little room by himself, got a man to wait on him, and gave him as much of her care and time as she could spare from her many duties. He was not an agreeable patient, I regret to say. He tried to bear his woes heroically, but did not succeed very well, not being used to any exertion of that sort; and, though in Christie's presence he did his best, his man confided to her that the Colonel was "as fractious as a teething baby, and the domineeringest party he ever nursed." Some of Mr. Fletcher's attempts were comical, and some pathetic, for though the sacred circle of her wedding ring was an effectual barrier against a look or word of love, Christie knew that the old affection was not dead, and it showed itself in his desire to win her respect by all sorts of small sacrifices and efforts at self-control. He would not use many of the comforts sent him, but insisted on wearing an army dressing-gown and slippers that caused him a secret pang every time his eye was affronted by their ugliness. Always after an angry scene with his servant, he would be found going round among the men, bestowing little luxuries and kind words; not condescendingly, but humbly, as if it was an atonement for his own shortcomings, and a tribute due to the brave fellows who bore their pains with a fortitude he could not imitate. Poor Philip, he tries so hard I must pity, not despise him, for he was never taught the manly virtues that make David what he is, thought Christie, as she went to him one day with an unusually happy heart. She found him sitting with a newly opened package before him, and a gloomy look upon his face. "See what rubbish one of my men has sent me, thinking I might value it," he said, pointing to a broken sword hilt, and offering her a badly written letter. She read it, and was touched by its affectionate respect and manly sympathy, for the good fellow had been one of those who saved the Colonel when he fell, and had kept the broken sword as a trophy of his bravery, thinking it might be precious in the eyes of them that loved him.
Poor Bernie might have spared himself the trouble, for I've no one to give it to, and in my eyes it's nothing but a bit of old metal," said Fletcher, pushing the parcel away with a half-irritated, half-melancholy look.
"Give it to me as a parting keepsake. I have a fine collection of relics of the brave men I have known, and this shall have a high place in my museum when I go home," said Christie, taking up the bit of old metal with more interest than she had ever felt in the brightest blade.
"Parting keepsake? Are you going away?"
asked Fletcher, catching at the words in anxious haste, yet looking pleased at her desire to keep the relic. "Yes, I'm ordered to report in Washington, and start to-morrow."
"Then I'll go as escort. The doctor has been wanting me to leave for a week, and now I've no desire to stay," he said eagerly.
But Christie shook her head, and began to fold up paper and string with nervous industry as she answered: "I am not going directly to Washington. I have a week's furlough first."
"And what is to become of me?"
asked Mr. Fletcher, as fretfully as a sick child, for he knew where her short holiday would be passed, and his temper got the upper hand for a minute. "You should go home and be comfortably nursed. You'll need care for some time, and your friends will be glad of a chance to give it, I've no doubt."
"I have no home, as you know, and I don't believe I've got a friend in the world who cares whether I live or die."
"This looks as if you were mistaken," and Christie glanced about the little room, which was full of comforts and luxuries accumulated during his stay. His face changed instantly, and he answered with the honest look and tone never given to any one but her:
"I beg your pardon. I'm an ungrateful brute, but you see I just made up my mind to do something worth the doing, and now it is made impossible in a way that renders it hard to bear. You are very patient with me, and I owe my life to your care. I never can thank you for it, but I will take myself out of your way as soon as I can, and leave you free to enjoy your happy holiday. Heaven knows you have earned it."
He said those last words so heartily that all the bitterness went out of his voice, and Christie found it easy to reply with a cordial smile: "I shall stay and see you comfortably off before I go myself. As for thanks and reward, I have had both, for you have done something worth the doing, and you give me this." She took up the broken blade as she spoke, and carried it away, looking proud of her new trophy. Fletcher left next day, saying while he pressed her hand as warmly as if the vigor of two had gone into his one:
"You will let me come and see you by and by, when you too get your discharge, won't you?"
"So gladly that you shall never again say you have no home. But you must take care of yourself, or you will get the long discharge, and we can't spare you yet," she answered warmly.
"No danger of that. The worthless ones are too often left to cumber the earth. It is the precious ones who are taken,"
he said, thinking of her as he looked into her tired face, and remembered all she had done for him. Christie shivered involuntarily at those ominous words, but only said, "Good-bye, Philip," as he went feebly away, leaning on his servant's arm, while all the men touched their caps, and wished the colonel a pleasant journey. End of Chapter 17. Recording by Linda Lee Paquet.
Chapter 18 of Work, A Story of Experience. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darla Ely. Work, A Story of Experience by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 18. Sunrise. 3 months later the war seemed drawing toward an end, and Christie was dreaming happy dreams of home and rest with David, when, as she sat one day writing a letter full of good news to the wife of a patient,
A telegram was handed to her, and tearing it open she read, "Captain Sterling dangerously wounded. Tell his wife to come at once. E. Wilkins." "No bad news, I hope, ma'am," said the young fellow anxiously, as his half-written letter fluttered to the ground, and Christie sat looking at that fateful strip of paper with all the strength and color stricken out of her face by the fear that fell upon her. "It might be worse. They told me he was dying once, and when I got to him he met me at the door. I'll hope for the best now as I did then, but I never felt like this before," and she hid her face as if daunted by ominous forebodings too strong to be controlled. In a moment she was up and doing as calm and steady as if her heart was not torn by an anxiety too keen for words. By the time the news had flown through the house, she was ready, and coming down with no luggage but a basket of comforts on her arm. She found the hall full of wan and crippled creatures gathered there to see her off, for no nurse in the hospital was more beloved than Mrs. Sterling. Many eyes followed her, many lips blessed her, many hands were outstretched for a sympathetic grasp, and, as the ambulance went clattering away, many hearts echoed the words of one grateful ghost of a man, "The Lord go with her and stand by her as she stood by us." It was not a long journey that lay before her, but to Christie it seemed interminable, for all the way one unanswerable question haunted her. Surely God will not be so cruel as to take David now when he has done his part so well and the reward is so near. It was dark when she arrived at the appointed spot, but Elisha Wilkins was there to receive her, and to her first breathless question, "How is David?" answered briskly, "Asleep and doing well, ma'am. At least I should say so. And I peeked at him the last thing before I started." "Where is he?" "In the little hospital over yonder. Camp warn't no place for him, and I fetched him here as the nighest and the best thing I could do for him." "How is he wounded?" "Shot in the shoulder, side, and arm." "Dangerously, you said?" "No, ma'am, that warn't and ain't my opinion. The sergeant sent that telegram, but I think he done wrong. The captain is hit pretty bad, but it ain't by no means desperate accordin' to my way of thinkin'," replied the hopeful Wilkins, who seemed mercifully gifted with an unusual flow of language. "Thank heaven! Now go on and tell me all about it as fast as you can," commanded Christie, walking along the rough road so rapidly that Private Wilkins would have been distressed both in wind and limb if discipline and hardship had not done much for him. "Well, you see we've been skirmishin' round here for a week, for the woods are full of rebs waitin' to surprise some commissary stores that's expected along. Contrabands is always comin' into camp, and we do the best we can for the poor devils and send 'em along where they'll be safe. Yesterday 4 women and a boy come, about as desperate a lot as I ever see, for they'd been 2 days and a night in the big swamp wadin' up to their waists in mud and water, with nothin' to eat, and babies on their backs all the way. Every woman had a child, one dead, but she'd fetched it, so it might be buried free, the poor soul said." Mr. Wilkins stopped an instant, as if for breath, but the thought of his own little chaps filled his heart with pity for that bereaved mother, and he understood now why decent men were willing to be shot and starved for the "confounded niggers," as he once called them. "Go on," said Christie, and he made haste to tell the little story that was so full of intense interest to his listener. "I never saw the captain so worked up as he was by the sight of them wretched women. He fed and warmed 'em, comforted their poor scared souls, gave what clothes he could find, buried the dead baby with his own hands, and nursed the other little creeters as if they were his own. It warn't safe to keep 'em more'n a day, so when night come the captain got 'em off down the river as quiet as he could. Me and another man helped him, for he wouldn't trust no one but himself to boss the job. A boat was ready, blessed if I know how he got it, and about midnight we led them women down to it. The boy was a strong lad, and any of 'em could help row, for the current would take 'em along rapid. This way, ma'am. We be going too fast for you?" "Not fast enough. Finish quick." We got down the bank all right, the captain standing in the little path that led to the river to keep guard, while Bates held the boat steady and I put the women in. Things was going lovely when the poor gal who lost her baby must needs jump out and run up to thank the captain again for all he'd done for her. Some of them sly rascals was watching the river. They see her, heard Bates call out, 'Come back, wench, come back,' and they fired. She did come back like a shot, and we gave that boat a push that sent it into the middle of the stream. Then we run along below the bank and come out further down to draw off the rebs. Some followed us, and we give it to 'em handsome, but some warn't deceived, and we heard 'em firing away at the captain, so we got back to him as fast as we could, but it warn't soon enough. Take my arm, Miss Sterling, it's kinder rough here." "And you found him?" "Lying right across the path with 2 dead men in front of him, for he'd kept 'em off like a lion till the firing brought up a lot of our fellers and the rebs skedaddled. I thought he was dead, for by the starlight I see he was bleeding awful. Hold on, my dear, hold on to me. He warn't, thank God, and looked up at me and says he, 'Are they safe?' 'They be, captain,' says I. 'Then it's all right,' says he, smiling in that bright way of his, and then dropped off as quiet as a lamb. We got him back to camp double quick, and when the surgeon see them 3 wounds he shook his head, and I mistrusted that it warn't no joke. So when the captain come to I asked him what I could do or get for him, and he answered in a whisper, 'My wife.'" For an instant Christie did hold on to Mr. Wilkins's arm, for those 2 words seemed to take all her strength away. Then the thought that David was waiting for her strung her nerves and gave her courage to bear anything. "Is he here?" she asked of her guide a moment later, as he stopped before a large half-ruined house, through whose windows dim lights and figures were seen moving to and fro. "Yes, ma'am. We've made a hospital of this. The captain's got the best room in it, and now he's got the best miss that's going anywheres. Won't you have a drop of something just as a stand-by before you see him?" "Nothing. Take me to him at once." "Here we be, then, still sleeping. That looks well." Mr. Wilkins softly led the way down a long hall, opened a door, and after one look fell back and saluted as the captain's wife passed in. A surgeon was bending over the low bed, and when a hoarse voice at his elbow asked, "How is he?" the doctor answered without looking up, "Done for. This shot through the lungs will finish him before morning, I'm afraid." "Then leave him to me. I am his wife," said the voice, clear and sharp now with the anguish those hard words had brought. "Good God! Why did no one tell me? My dear lady, I thought you were a nurse," cried the poor surgeon, rent with remorse for what now seemed the brutal frankness of his answer, as he saw the white face of the woman at his side with a look in her eyes harder to see than the bitterest tears that ever fell. "I am a nurse. If you can do nothing, please go and leave him to me the little while he has to live." Without a word the surgeon vanished, and Christie was alone with David. The instant she saw him she felt that there was no hope, for she had seen too many faces wear the look his wore to be deceived even by her love. Lying with closed eyes, already sunken by keen suffering, hair damp with the cold dew on his forehead, a scarlet spot on either cheek, gray lines about the mouth, and pale lips parted by the painful breaths that came in heavy gasps or fluttered fitfully. This was what Christie saw, and after that long look she knew the truth, and sunk down beside the bed, crying with an exceeding bitter cry, "Oh, David! Oh, my husband! Must I give you up so soon?" His eyes opened then, and he turned his cheek to hers, whispering with a look that tried to be a smile, but ended in a sigh of satisfaction, "I knew you'd come." Then, as a tearless sob shook her from head to foot, he added steadily, though each breath cost a pang, "Yes, dear, I must go first, but it won't be hard with you to help me do it bravely." In that supremely bitter moment there returned to Christie's memory certain words of the marriage service that had seemed so beautiful when she took part in it, "For better, for worse, till death do us part." She had known the better, so short, so sweet. This was the worst. Until death came, she must keep faithfully the promise made with such a happy heart. The thought brought with it unexpected strength, and gave her courage to crush down her grief, seal up her tears, and show a brave and tender face as she took that feeble hand in hers ready to help her husband die. He saw, and thanked her for the effort, felt the sustaining power of a true wife's heart, and seemed to have no other care, since she was by him steadfast to the end. He lay looking at her with such serene and happy eyes that she would not let a tear, a murmur, mar his peace, and for a little while she felt as if she had gone out of this turbulent world into a heavenly one, where love reigned supreme. But such hours are as brief as beautiful, and at midnight mortal suffering proved that immortal joy had not yet begun. Christie had sat by many deathbeds, but never one like this, for through all the bitter pangs that tried his flesh, David's soul remained patient and strong, upheld by the faith that conquers pain and makes even death a friend. In the quiet time that went before, he had told his last wishes, given his last messages of love, and now had but one desire, to go soon that Christie might be spared the trial of seeing suffering she could neither lighten nor share. "Go and rest, dear, go and rest," he whispered more than once. "Let Wilkins come. This is too much for you. I thought it would be easier, but I am so strong life fights for me inch by inch." But Christie would not go, and for her sake David made haste to die. Hour after hour the tide ebbed fast. Hour after hour the man's patient soul sat waiting for release, and hour after hour the woman's passionate heart clung to the love that seemed drifting away, leaving her alone upon the shore. Once or twice she could not bear it and cried out in her despair, "No! It is not just that you should suffer this for a creature whose whole life is not worth a day of your brave, useful, precious one. Why did you pay such a price for that girl's liberty?" she said as the thought of her own wrecked future fell upon her dark and heavy. "Because I owed it. She suffered more than this seeing her baby die. I thought of you in her place, and I could not help doing it." The broken answer, the reproachful look, wrung Christie's heart, and she was silent. For, in all the knightly tales she loved so well, what Sir Galahad had rescued a more wretched, wronged, and helpless woman than the poor soul whose dead baby David buried tenderly before he bought the mother's freedom with his life? Only one regret escaped him as the end drew very near, and mortal weakness brought relief from mortal pain. The first red streaks of dawn shone in the east, and his dim eyes brightened at the sight. "Such a beautiful world," he whispered with the ghost of a smile. "It's so much good work to do in it. I wish I could stay and help a little longer," he added, while the shadow deepened on his face. But soon he said, trying to press Christie's hand, still holding his, "You will do my part, and do it better than I could. Don't mourn, dear heart, but work, and by you will be comforted." "I will try, but I think I shall soon follow you, and need no comfort here," answered Christie, already finding consolation in the thought. "What is it, David?" she asked a little later as she saw his eyes turn wistfully toward the window where the rosy glow was slowly creeping up the sky. "I want to see the sunrise. That used to be our happy time. Turn my face toward the light, Christie, and we'll wait for it together." An hour later, when the first pale ray crept in at the low window, two faces lay upon the pillow, one full of the despairing grief for which there seems no balm, the other with lips and eyes of solemn peace, and that mysterious expression, lovelier than any smile, which death leaves as a tender token that all is well with the new-born soul. To Christie, that was the darkest hour of the dawn, but for David, sunrise had already come. End of Chapter 18. Sunrise.
Chapter 19 of Work, A Story of Experience. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns. Work, A Story of Experience by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 19 Little Heart's Ease. When it was all over, the long journey home, the quiet funeral, the first sad excitement, then came the bitter moment when life says to the bereaved, "Take up your burden and go on alone." Christie's had been the still, tearless grief, hardest to bear, most impossible to comfort, and, while Mrs. Sterling bore her loss with the sweet patience of a pious heart, and Letty mourned her brother with a tender sorrow that finds relief in natural ways, the widow sat among them as tranquil, colorless, and mute, as if her soul had followed David, leaving the shadow of her former self behind. "He will not come to me, but I shall go to him," seemed to be the thought that sustained her. And those who loved her said despairingly to one another, "Her heart is broken, she will not linger long." But one woman, wise in her own motherliness, always answered hopefully, "Don't you be troubled. Nature knows what's good for us, and works in her own way. Hearts like this don't break, and sorrow only makes 'em stronger. You mark my words, the blessed baby that's a comin' in the summer will work a miracle, and you'll see this poor dear a happy woman yet." Few believed in the prophecy, but Mrs. Wilkins stoutly repeated it and watched over Christie like a mother, often trudging up the lane in spite of wind or weather to bring some dainty mess, some remarkable puzzle in red or yellow calico, to be used as a pattern for the little garments the three women sewed with such tender interest, consecrated with such tender tears, or news of the war fresh from Militia, who was goin' to see it through if he come home without a leg to stand on. A cheery, hopeful, wholesome influence she brought with her, and all the house seemed to brighten as she sat there freeing her mind upon every subject that came up, from the delicate little shirts Mrs. Sterling knit in spite of failing eyesight, to the fall of Richmond, which, the prophetic spirit being strong within her, Mrs. Wilkins foretold with sibylline precision. She alone could win a faint smile from Christie, with some odd saying, some shrewd opinion, and she alone brought tears to the melancholy eyes that sorely needed such healing dew, for she carried little Adelaide, and without a word put her into Christie's arms, there to cling and smile and babble till she had soothed the bitter pain and hunger of a suffering heart. She and Mr. Power held Christie up through that hard time, ministering to soul and body with their hope and faith till life grew possible again, and from the dust of a great affliction rose the sustaining power she had sought so long. As spring came on, and victory over victory proclaimed that the war was drawing to an end, Christie's sad resignation was broken by gusts of grief so stormy, so inconsolable, that those about her trembled for her life. It was so hard to see the regiments come home proudly bearing the torn battle flags, weary, wounded, but victorious, to be rapturously welcomed, thanked, and honored by the grateful country they had served so well. To see all this and think of David in his grave unknown, unrewarded, and forgotten by all but a faithful few. I used to dream of a time like this, to hope and plan for it, and cheer myself with the assurance that, after all our hard work, our long separation, and the dangers we had faced, David would get some honor, receive some reward, at least be kept for me to love and serve and live with for a little while. But these men who have merely saved a banner, led a charge, or lost an arm, get all the glory, while he gave his life so nobly. Yet few know it, no one thanked him, and I am left desolate when so many useless ones might have been taken in his place. Oh, it is not just! I cannot forgive God for robbing him of all his honours, and me of all my happiness." So lamented Christie, with the rebellious protest of a strong nature learning submission through the stern discipline of grief. In vain Mr. Power told her that David had received a better reward than any human hand could give him, in the gratitude of many women, the respect of many men; that to do bravely the daily duties of an upright life was more heroic in God's sight than to achieve in an enthusiastic moment a single deed that won the world's applause, and that the seeming incompleteness of his life was beautifully rounded by the act that caused his death. Although no eulogy recorded it, no song embalmed it, and few knew it was but those he saved, those he loved, and the great commander who promoted him to the higher rank he had won. Christie could not be content with this invisible, intangible recompense for her hero. She wanted to see, to know beyond a doubt that justice had been done, and beat herself against the barrier that baffles bereaved humanity till impatient despair was wearied out, and passionate heart gave up the struggle. Then, when no help seemed possible, she found it where she least expected it, in herself. Searching for religion, she had found love. Now seeking to follow love, she had found religion. The desire for it had never left her, and while serving others, she was earning this reward. For when her life seemed to lie in ashes, from their midst the slender spire of flame, purifying while it burned, rose trembling toward heaven, showing her how great sacrifices turned to greater compensations, giving her light, warmth, and consolation, and teaching her the lesson all must learn. God was very patient with her, sending much help, and letting her climb up to him by all the tender ways in which aspiring souls can lead unhappy hearts. David's room had been her refuge when those dark hours came, and sitting there one day trying to understand the great mystery that parted her from David, she seemed to receive an answer to her many prayers for some sign that death had not estranged them. The house was very still, the window open, and a soft south wind was wandering through the room with hints of mayflowers on its wings. Suddenly a breath of music startled her, so airy, sweet, and short-lived that no human voice or hand could have produced it. Again and again it came, a fitful and melodious sigh, that to one made superstitious by much sorrow seemed like a spirit's voice, delivering some message from another world. Christie looked and listened with hushed breath and expectant heart, believing that some special answer was to be given her. But in a moment she saw it was no supernatural sound, only the south wind whispering in David's flute, that hung beside the window. Disappointment came first. Then warm, over her sore heart, flowed the tender recollection that she used to call the old flute David's voice, for into it he poured the joy and sorrow, unrest and pain, he told no living soul. How often it had been her lullaby, before she learned to read its language, how gaily it had piped for others, how plaintively it had sung for him, alone and in the night, and now how full of pathetic music was that hymn of consolation fitfully whispered by the wind's soft breath. Ah, yes, this was a better answer than any supernatural voice could have given her, a more helpful sign than any phantom face or hand, a surer confirmation of her hope than subtle argument or sacred promise, for it brought back the memory of the living, loving man so vividly, so tenderly, that Christie felt as if the barrier was down, and welcomed the new sense of David's nearness with the softest tears that had flowed since she closed the serene eyes whose last look had been for her. After that hour she spent the long spring days lying on the old couch in his room, reading his books, thinking of his love and life, and listening to David's voice. She always heard it now, whether the wind touched the flute with airy fingers or it hung mute, and it sung to her songs of patience, hope, and cheer, till a mysterious peace came to her, and she discovered in herself the strength she had asked, yet never thought to find. Under the snow, herbs of grace had been growing silently, and when the heavy rains had melted all the frost away, they sprung up to blossom beautifully in the sun that shines for every spire of grass, and makes it perfect in its time and place. Mrs. Wilkins was right, for one June morning, when she laid that blessed baby in its mother's arms, Christie's first words were, "Don't let me die, I must live for baby now," and gathered David's little daughter to her breast, as if the soft touch of the fumbling hands had healed every wound and brightened all the world. "I told you so. God bless 'em both!" And Mrs. Wilkins retired precipitately to the hall, where she sat down upon the stairs and cried most comfortable tears, for her maternal heart was full of a thanksgiving too deep for words. A sweet secluded time to Christie, as she brooded over her little treasure and forgot there was a world outside. A fond and jealous mother, but a very happy one, for after the bitterest came the tenderest experience of her life. She felt its sacredness, its beauty, and its high responsibilities, accepted them prayerfully, and found unspeakable delight in fitting herself to bear them worthily, always remembering that she had a double duty to perform toward the fatherless little creature given to her care. It is hardly necessary to mention the changes one small individual made in that feminine household. The purring and clucking that went on, the panics over a pinprick, the consolations over a pellet of chamomilla, the raptures at the dawn of a first smile, the solemn prophecies of future beauty, wit, and wisdom in the bud of a woman, the general adoration of the entire family at the wicker shrine wherein lay the idol, a mass of flannel and cambric, with a bald head at one end, and a pair of microscopic blue socks at the other. Mysterious little porringers sat unreproved upon the parlor fire, small garments aired at every window, lights burned at unholy hours, and 3 agitated nightcaps congregated at the faintest chirp of the restless bird in the maternal nest. Of course, Grandma grew young again, and produced nursery reminiscences on every occasion. Aunt Letty trotted day and night to gratify the imaginary wants of the idol, and Christie was so entirely absorbed that the whole South might have been swallowed up by an earthquake without causing her as much consternation as the appearance of a slight rash upon the baby. No flower in David's garden throve like his little June rose, for no wind was allowed to visit her too roughly, and when rain fell without, she took her daily airing in the greenhouse, where from her mother's arm she soon regarded the gay sight with such sprightly satisfaction that she seemed a little flower herself, dancing on its stem. She was named Ruth for Grandma, but Christie always called her Little Heart's Ease, or Pansy, and those who smiled at first at the mother's fancy came in time to see that there was an unusual fitness in the name. All the bitterness seemed taken out of Christie's sorrow by the soft magic of the child. There was so much to live for now, she spoke no more of dying, and holding that little hand in hers, it grew easier to go on along the way that led to David. A prouder mother never lived, and as baby waxed in her beauty and in strength, Christie longed for all the world to see her. A sweet, peculiar little face she had, sunny and fair, but under the broad forehead, where the bright hair fell as David's used to do, there shone a pair of dark and solemn eyes, so large, so deep, and often so unchildlike that her mother wondered where she got them. Even when she smiled the shadow lingered in these eyes, and when she wept they filled and overflowed with great quiet tears, like flowers too full of dew. Christie often said remorsefully, "My little Pansy, I put my own sorrow into your baby soul, and now it looks back at me with a strange wistfulness, and these great drops are the unsubmissive tears I locked up in my heart because I would not be grateful for the good gift God gave me, even while he took that other one away. Oh, baby, forgive your mother, and don't let her find that she has given you clouds instead of sunshine." This fear helped Christie to keep her own face cheerful, her own heart tranquil, her own life as sunny, healthful, and hopeful as she wished her child's to be. For this reason she took garden and greenhouse into her own hands when Bennet gave them up, and with the stout lad to help her, did well this part of the work that David bequeathed to her. It was a pretty sight to see the mother with her year-old daughter out among the fresh green things, the little golden head bobbing here and there like a stray sunbeam, the baby voice telling sweet, unintelligible stories to bird and bee and butterfly, or the small creature fast asleep in a basket under a rose bush, swinging in a hammock from a tree, or in Bran's keeping, rosy, vigorous, and sweet with sun and air, and the wholesome influence of a wise and tender love. While Christie worked she planned her daughter's future, as mothers will, and had but one care concerning it. She did not fear poverty, but the thought of being straitened for the means of educating little Ruth afflicted her. She meant to teach her to labor heartily and see no degradation in it, but she could not bear to feel that her child should be denied the harmless pleasures that make youth sweet, the opportunities that educate, the society that ripens character and gives a rank which money cannot buy. A little sum to put away for baby, safe from all risk, ready to draw from as each need came, and sacredly devoted to this end was now Christie's sole ambition. With this purpose at her heart, she watched her fruit and nursed her flowers, found no task too hard, no sun too hot, no weed too unconquerable, and soon the garden David planted when his life seemed barren yielded lovely harvests to swell his little daughter's portion. One day Christie received a letter from Uncle Enos, expressing a wish to see her if she cared to come so far and stop a spell. It both surprised and pleased her, and she resolved to go, glad that the old man remembered her, and proud to show him the great success of her life as she considered baby. So she went, was hospitably received by the ancient cousin 5 times removed who kept house, and greeted with as much cordiality as Uncle Enos ever showed to anyone. He looked askance at baby, as if he had not bargained for the honor of her presence, but he said nothing, and Christie wisely refrained from mentioning that Ruth was the most remarkable child ever born. She soon felt at home, and went about the old house visiting familiar nooks with the bitter, sweet satisfaction of such returns. It was sad to miss Aunt Betsy in the big kitchen, strange to see Uncle Enos sit all day in his armchair, too helpless now to plod about the farm and carry terror to the souls of those who served him. He was still a crabbed, gruff old man, but the narrow, hard, old heart was a little softer than it used to be, and he sometimes betrayed the longing for his kindred that the aged often feel when infirmity makes them desire tenderer props than any they can hire. Christie saw this wish, and tried to gratify it with a dutiful affection which could not fail to win its way. Baby unconsciously lent a hand, for Uncle Enos could not long withstand the sweet enticements of this little kinswoman. He did not own the conquest in words, but was seen to cuddle his small captivator in private, allowed all sorts of liberties with his spectacles, his pockets, and his bald pate, and never seemed more comfortable than when she confiscated his newspaper, and sitting on his knee, read it to him in a pretty language of her own. "She's a good little gal, looks considerable like you, but you weren't never such a quiet puss as she is," he said one day, as the child was toddling about the room with an old doll of her mother's, lately disinterred from its tomb in the garret. "She is like her father in that, but I get quieter as I grow old, uncle," answered Christie, who sat sewing near him. "You be growing old, that's a fact, but somehow it's kind o' becomin'. I never thought you'd be so much of a lady, and look so well after all you've been through," added Uncle Enos, vainly trying to discover what made Christie's manners so agreeable in spite of her plain dress, and her face so pleasant in spite of the gray hair at her temples and the lines about her mouth. It grew still pleasanter to see as she smiled and looked up at him with the soft yet bright expression that always made him think of her mother. "I'm glad you don't consider me an entire failure, uncle. You know you predicted it. But though I have gone through a good deal, I don't regret my attempt, and when I look at Pansy, I feel as if I'd made a grand success. You haven't made much money, I guess, but if you don't mind tellin', What have you got to live on?" asked the old man, unwilling to acknowledge any life a success if dollars and cents were left out of it. "Only David's pension and what I can make by my garden." "The old lady has to have somewhat, don't she? She has a little money of her own, but I see that she and Letty have 2/3 of all I make." "That ain't a fair bargain if you do all the work." "Ah, but we don't make bargains, sir. We work for one another, and share everything together." "So like women," grumbled Uncle Enos, longing to see that the property was fixed up square. "How you going to educate the little gal? I suppose you think as much of Coulter and so on as ever you did," he presently added with a gruff laugh. "More," answered Christie, smiling too, as she remembered the old quarrels. "I shall earn the money, sir. If the garden fails, I can teach, nurse, sew, write, cook even, for I've half a dozen useful accomplishments at my fingers' ends, thanks to the education you and dear Aunt Betsy gave me, and I may have to use them all for Pansy's sake." Pleased by the compliment, yet a little conscience-stricken at the small share he deserved of it, Uncle Enos sat rubbing up his glasses a minute before he led to the subject he had in his mind. "If you fall sick or die, what then?" "I've thought of that," and Christie caught up the child as if her love could keep even death at bay. But Pansy soon struggled down again, for the dirty-faced doll was taking a walk and could not be detained. "If I am taken from her, then my little girl must do as her mother did. God has orphans in his special care, and he won't forget her, I am sure." Uncle Enos had a coughing spell just then, and when he got over it he said with effort, for even to talk of giving away his substance cost him a pang: "I'm getting to years now, and it's about time I fixed up matters in case I'm took sudden. I always meant to give you a little something, but as you didn't ask for it, I took care on it, and it ain't none the worse for waiting a spell. I just speak on it, so you needn't be anxious about the little gal. It ain't much, but it will make things easy, I reckon." "You are very kind, uncle, and I am more grateful than I can tell. I don't want a penny for myself, but I should love to know that my daughter was to have an easier life than mine." "I suppose you thought of that when you come so quick," said the old man, with a suspicious look that made Christie's eyes kindle as they used to years ago, but she answered honestly, "I did think of it and hope it, yet I should have come quicker if you had been in the poorhouse." Neither spoke for a minute, for, in spite of generosity and gratitude, the two natures struck fire when they met as inevitably as flint and steel. "What's your opinion of missionaries?" asked Uncle Enos, after a spell of meditation. "If I had any money to leave them, I should bequeath it to those who help the heathen here at home, and should let the innocent Fiji Islanders worship their idols a little longer in benighted peace," answered Christie, in her usual decided way. "That's my idea exactly, but it's uncommon hard to settle which of them that stays at home you'll trust your money to. You see, Betsy was always pestering me to give to charity things, but I told her it was better to save up and give it in a handsome lump that looked well, and was a credit to you. When she was dying, she reminded me on it, and I promised I'd do something before I followed. I've been turning on over in my mind for a number of months, and I don't seem to find anything that's just right. You've been round among the charity folks lately, according to your tell. Now what would you do if you had a tidy little sum to dispose on?" "Help the freed people?" The answer came so quick that it nearly took the old gentleman's breath away, and he looked at his niece with his mouth open after an involuntary "Sho!" had escaped him. "David helped give them the liberty, and I would so gladly help them to enjoy it," cried Christie, all the old enthusiasm blazing up, but with a clearer, steadier flame than in the days when she dreamed splendid dreams by the kitchen fire. "Well, no, that wouldn't meet my views. What else is there?" asked the old man, quite unwarmed by her benevolent ardor. "Wounded soldiers, destitute children, ill-paid women, young people struggling for independence, homes, hospitals, schools, churches, and God's charity all over the world." "That's the pesky part on it. There's such a lot to choose from. I don't know much about any of 'em," began Uncle Enos, looking like a perplexed raven with a treasure which it cannot decide where to hide. Whose fault is that, sir?" The question hit the old man full in the conscience, and he winced, remembering how many of Betsy's charitable impulses he had nipped in the bud. And now all the accumulated alms she would have been so glad to scatter weighed upon him heavily. He rubbed his bald head with a yellow bandana, and moved uneasily in his chair, as if he wanted to get up and finish the neglected job that made his helplessness so burdensome. "I'll ponder on it a spell, and make up my mind," was all he said, and never renewed the subject again. But he had very little time to ponder, and he never did make up his mind, for a few months after Christie's long visit ended, Uncle Enos was took sudden, and left all he had to her. Not an immense fortune, but far larger than she expected, and great was her anxiety to use wisely this unlooked-for benefaction. She was very grateful, and she kept nothing for herself, feeling that David's pension was enough, and preferring the small sum he earned so dearly to the thousands the old man had hoarded up for years. A good portion was put by for Ruth, something for mother and Letty, that want might never touch them, and the rest she kept for David's work, believing that, so spent, the money would be blessed. End of chapter 19. Recording by Jennifer Stearns in Concord, New Hampshire.
Chapter 20 of Work, a Story of Experience. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Work, a Story of Experience by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 20. At 40. Nearly 20 years since I set out to seek my fortune. It has been a long search, but I think I have found it at last. I only ask to be a useful, happy woman, and my wish is granted, for I believe I am useful. I know I am happy. Christie looked so as she sat alone in the flowery parlour one September afternoon, thinking over her life with a grateful, cheerful spirit. 40 today, and pausing at that halfway house between youth and age. She looked back into the past without bitter regret or unsubmissive grief, and forward into the future with courageous patience. For 3 good angels attended her, and with faith, hope, and charity to brighten life, no woman need lament lost youth or fear approaching age. Christie did not, and though her eyes filled with quiet tears as they were raised to the faded cap and sheathed sword hanging on the wall, none fell, and in a moment tender sorrow changed to still tenderer joy as her glance wandered to rosy little Ruth playing hospital with her dollies in the porch. Then they shone with genuine satisfaction as they went from the letters and papers on her table to the garden, where several young women were at work, with a healthful colour in their cheeks that had been very pale and thin in the spring. I think David is satisfied with me, for I have given all my heart and strength to his work, and it prospers well, she said to herself, and then her face grew thoughtful as she recalled a late event which seemed to have opened a new field of labour for her if she chose to enter it. A few evenings before, she had gone to one of the many meetings of working women, which had made some stir of late. Not a first visit, for she was much interested in the subject and full of sympathy for this class of workers. There were speeches, of course, and of the most unparliamentary sort, for the meeting was composed almost entirely of women, each eager to tell her special grievance or theory. Any one who chose got up and spoke, and whether wisely or foolishly each proved how great was the ferment now going on, and how difficult it was for the two classes to meet and help one another in spite of the utmost need on one side and the sincerest goodwill on the other. The workers poured out their wrongs and hardships passionately or plaintively, demanding or imploring justice, sympathy, and help, displaying the ignorance, incapacity, and prejudice which make their need all the more pitiful, their relief all the more imperative. The ladies did their part with kindliness, patience, and often unconscious condescension, showing in their turn how little they knew of the real trials of the women whom they longed to serve, how very narrow a sphere of usefulness they were fitted for in spite of culture and intelligence, and how rich they were in generous theories, how poor in practical methods of relief. One accomplished creature, with learning radiating from every pore, delivered a charming little essay on the strong-minded women of antiquity. Then, taking labour into the region of art, painted delightful pictures of the time when all would work harmoniously together in an ideal republic, where each did the task she liked, and was paid for it in liberty, equality, and fraternity. Unfortunately, she talked over the heads of her audience, and it was like telling fairy tales to hungry children to describe as Paquet discussing Greek politics with Pericles and Plato, reposing upon ivory couches, or Hypatia modestly delivering philosophical lectures to young men behind a Tyrian purple curtain. And the ideal republic met with little favour from anxious seamstresses, typesetters, and shopgirls, who said ungratefully among themselves, "That's all very pretty, but I don't see how it's going to better wages among us now." Another eloquent sister gave them a political oration which fired the revolutionary blood in their veins, and made them eager to rush to the State House en masse, and demand the ballot before one half of them were quite clear what it meant, and the other half were as unfit for it as any ignorant Patrick bribed with $1 and a sup of whisky. A third well-wisher quenched their ardour like a wet blanket, by reading reports of sundry labour reforms in foreign parts, most interesting, but made entirely futile by difference of climate, needs, and customs. She closed with a cheerful budget of statistics, giving the exact number of needle-women who had starved, gone mad, or committed suicide during the past year, the enormous profits wrung by capitalists from the blood and muscles of their employers, and the alarming increase in the cost of living, which was about to plunge the nation into debt and famine, if not destruction generally. When she sat down, despair was visible on many countenances, and immediate starvation seemed to be waiting at the door to clutch them as they went out, for the impressible creatures believed every word and saw no salvation anywhere. Christie had listened intently to all this, had admired, regretted, or condemned as each spoke, and felt a steadily increasing sympathy for all, and a strong desire to bring the helpers and the helped into truer relations with each other. The dear ladies were so earnest, so hopeful, and so unpractically benevolent, that it grieved her to see so much breath wasted, so much goodwill astray, while the expectant, despondent, or excited faces of the work-women touched her heart, for well she knew how much they needed help, how eager they were for light, how ready to be led if someone would only show a possible way. As the statistical extinguisher retired, beaming with satisfaction at having added her mite to the good cause, a sudden and uncontrollable impulse moved Christie to rise in her place and ask leave to speak. It was readily granted, and a little stir of interest greeted her, for she was known to many as Mr. Powers's friend, David Stirling's wife, or an army nurse who had done well. Whispers circulated quickly, and faces brightened as they turned toward her, for she had a helpful look, and her first words pleased them. When the President invited her to the platform, she paused on the lowest step, saying with an expressive look and gesture, "I am better here, thank you, for I have been and mean to be a working woman all my life." "Hear, hear!" cried a stout matron in a gay bonnet, and the rest endorsed the sentiment with a hearty round. Then they were very still, and then, in a clear, steady voice, with the sympathetic undertone to it that is so magical in its effect, Christie made her first speech in public since she left the stage. That early training stood her in good stead now, giving her self-possession, power of voice, and ease of gesture, while the purpose at her heart lent her the sort of simple eloquence that touches, persuades, and convinces better than logic, flattery, or oratory. What she said she hardly knew. Words came faster than she could utter them. Thoughts pressed upon her, and all the lessons of her life rose vividly before her to give weight to her arguments, value to her counsel, and the force of truth to every sentence she uttered. She had known so many of the same trials, troubles, and temptations that she could speak understandingly of them, and, better still, she had conquered or outlived so many of them, that she could not only pity but help others to do as she had done. Having found in labour her best teacher, comforter, and friend, she could tell those who listened that, no matter how hard or humble the task at the beginning, if faithfully and bravely performed, it would surely prove a stepping-stone to something better, and with each honest effort they were fitting themselves for the nobler labour and large liberty God meant them to enjoy. The women felt that this speaker was one of them, for the same lines were on her face that they saw on their own. Her hands were no fine lady's hands, her dress plainer than some of theirs, her speech simple enough for all to understand, cheerful, comforting, and full of practical suggestion, illustrations out of their own experience, and a spirit of companionship that uplifted their despondent hearts. Yet more impressive than anything she said was the subtle magnetism of character, for that as a universal language which all can understand. They saw and felt that a genuine woman stood down there among them like a sister, ready with head, heart, and hand to help them help themselves, no offering pity as an alms, but justice as a right. Hardship and sorrow, long effort and late won reward had been hers they knew. Wifehood, motherhood, and widowhood brought her very near to them, and behind her was the background of an earnest life, against which this figure, with health on the cheeks, hope in the eyes, courage on the lips, and the ardour of a wide benevolence warming the whole countenance, stood out full of unconscious dignity and beauty, an example to comfort, touch, and inspire them. It was not a long speech, and in it there was no learning, no statistics, and no politics. Yet it was the speech of the evening, and when it was over no one else seemed to have anything to say. As the meeting broke up, Christie's hand was shaken by many roughened by the needle, stained with printer's ink, or hard with humbler toil. Many faces smiled gratefully at her, and many voices thanked her heartily. But sweeter than any applause were the words of one woman who grasped her hand, and whispered with wet eyes, "I knew your blessed husband. He was very good to me, and I've been thanking the Lord he had such a wife for his reward." Christie was thinking of all this as she sat alone that day, and asking herself if she should go on, for the ladies had been as grateful as the women, had begged her to come and speak again, saying they needed such much a mediator to bridge across the space that now divided them from those they wished to serve. She certainly seemed fitted to act as interpreter between the two classes, for from the gentleman her father she had inherited the fine instincts, gracious manners, and unblemished name of an old and honourable race. From the farmer's daughter, her mother, came the equally valuable dower of practical virtues, a sturdy love of independence, a great respect for the skill and courage that can win it. Such women were much needed, and are not always easy to find, for even in democratic America the hand that earns its daily bread must wear some talent, name, or honour as an ornament, before it is very cordially shaken by those that wear white gloves. "Perhaps this is the task my life has been fitting me for," she said, "a great and noble one, which I should be proud to accept and help accomplish, if I can. Others have finished the emancipation work, and done it splendidly, even at the cost of all this blood and sorrow. I came too late to do anything but give my husband, and behold the glorious end. This new task seems to offer me the chance of being among the pioneers, to do the hard work, share the persecution, and help lay the foundation of a new emancipation whose happy success I may never see. Yet I had rather be remembered as those brave beginners are, though many of them missed the triumph, than as the late comers will be, who only beat the drums and wave the banners when the victory is won." Just then the gate creaked on its hinges, a step sounded in the porch, and little Ruth ran in to say in an audible whisper, "It's a lady, mamma, a very pretty lady. Can you see her?" "Yes, dear. Ask her in." There was a rustle of sweeping silks through the narrow hall, a vision of a very lovely woman in the doorway, and two daintily gloved hands were extended as an eager voice asked, "Dearest Christie, don't you remember Bella Carroll?" Christie did remember, and had her in her arms directly, utterly regardless of the imminent destruction of a marvellous hat, or the bad effect of tears on violet ribbons. Presently they were sitting close together, talking with April faces, and telling their stories as women must when they meet after the lapse of years. A few letters had passed between them, but Bella had been abroad, and Christie too busy living her life to have much time to write about it. "Your mother, Bella, how is she, and where?" "Still with Augustine, and he, you know, is melancholy mad, very quiet, very patient, and very kind to every one but himself. His penances for the sins of his race would soon kill him if mother was not there to watch over him, and her penance is never to leave him." "Dear child, don't tell me any more, it is too sad. Talk of yourself and Harry. Now you smile, so I'm sure all is well with him." "Yes, thank heaven, Christie. I do believe fate means to spare us, as dear old Dr. Shirley said. I never can be gay again, but I keep as cheerful and busy as I can, for Harry's sake, and he does the same for mine. We shall always be together, and all in all to one another, for we can never marry and have homes apart, you know. We have wandered over the face of the earth for several years, and now we mean to settle down and be as happy and as useful as we can." "That's brave. I am so glad to hear it, and so truly thankful it is possible. But tell me, Bella, what Harry means to do. You spoke in one of your first letters of his being hard at work studying medicine. Is that to be his profession?" "Yes, I don't know what made him choose it, unless it was the hope that he might spare other families from a curse like ours, or lighten it if it came. After Helen's death he was a changed creature, no longer a wild boy, but a man. I told him what you said to me, and it gave him hope. Dr. Shirley confirmed it as far as he dared, and Hal resolved to make the most of his one chance by interesting himself in some absorbing study, and leaving no room for fear, no time for dangerous recollections. I was so glad, and mother so comforted, for we both feared that sad trouble would destroy him. He studied hard, got on splendidly, and then went abroad to finish off. I went with him, for poor August was past hope, and mamma would not let me help her. The doctor said it was best for me to be away, and excellent for Hal to have me with him, to cheer him up, and keep him steady with a little responsibility. We have been happy together in spite of our trouble, he in his profession and I in him. Now he is ready, so we have come home, and now the hardest part begins for me." "How, Bella?" "He has his work and loves it. I have nothing after my duty to him is done. I find I've lost my taste for the old pleasures and pursuits, and though I have tried more sober, solid ones, there still remains much time to hang heavy on my hands, and such an empty place in my heart, that even Harry's love cannot fill it. I'm afraid I shall get melancholy. That is the beginning of the end for us, you know." As Bella spoke, the light died out of her eyes, and they grew despairing with the gloom of a tragic memory. Christie drew the beautiful, pathetic face close upon her bosom, longing to comfort, yet feeling very powerless to lighten Bella's burden. But Christie's little daughter did it for her, Ruth had been standing near regarding the pretty lady with as much wonder and admiration as if she thought her a fairy princess, who might vanish before she got a good look at her. Divining with a child's quick instinct that the princess was in trouble, Ruth flew into the porch, caught up her latest and dearest treasure, and presented it as a sure consolation, with such sweet goodwill that Bella could not refuse, although it was only a fuzzy caterpillar in a little box. "I give it to you because it is my nicest one and just ready to spin up. Do you like pussy pillars and know how they do it?" asked Ruth, emboldened by the kiss she got in return for her offering. "Tell me all about it, darling," and Bella could not help smiling as the child fixed her great eyes upon her and told her little story with such earnestness that she was breathless by the time she ended. "At first they are only grubs, you know, and stay down in the earth. Then they are like this, nice and downy and humpy when they walk, and when it's time they spin up and go to sleep. It's all dark in their little beds, and they don't know what may happen to 'em, but they are not afraid, 'cause God takes care of 'em. So they wait and don't fret, and when it's right for 'em, they come out splendid butterflies, all beautiful and shining like your gown. They are happy then, and fly away to eat honey and live in the air and never be creeping worms any more." "That's a pretty lesson for me," said Bella softly. "I accept and thank you for it, little teacher. I'll try to be a patient pussy pillar, though it is dark, and I don't know what may happen to me, and I'll wait hopefully till it's time to float away a happy butterfly." "Go and get the friends some flowers, the gayest and sweetest you can find, Pansy," said Christie, and as the child ran off, she added to her friend, "Now we must think of something pleasant for you to do. It may take a little time, but I know we shall find your niche if we give our minds to it. That's one reason why I came. I heard some friends of mine talking about you yesterday, and they seemed to think you were equal to anything in the way of good works. Charity is the usual refuge for people like me, so I wished to try it. I don't mind doing or seeing sad or disagreeable things, if it only fills up my life and helps me to forget. You will help more by giving of your abundance to those who know how to dispense it wisely than by trying to do it yourself, my dear. I never advise pretty creatures like you to tuck up their silk gowns and go down into sloughs and alms with the poor, who don't like it any better than you do, and so much pity and money are wasted in sentimental charity." "Then what shall I do?" "If you choose, you can find plenty of work in your own class, for, if you will allow me to say it, they need help quite as much as the paupers, though in a very different way." "Oh, you mean I'm to be strong-minded, to cry aloud and spare not, to denounce their iniquities and demand their money all their lives?" "Now, Bella, that's personal, for I made my first speech a night or two ago." "I know you did, and I wish I'd heard it. I'd make mine tonight if I could do it as half as well as I'm told you did," interrupted Bella, clapping her hands with a face full of approval. But Christie was in earnest, and produced her new project with all speed. "I want you to try a little experiment for me, and if it succeeds, You shall have all the glory. I've been waiting for someone to undertake it, and I fancy you are the woman. Not everyone could attempt it, for it needs wealth and position, beauty and accomplishments, much tact, and more than all a heart that has not been spoilt by the world, but taught through sorrow how to value and use life well. Christie, what is it? This experiment that needs so much, and yet which you think me capable of trying?" asked Bella, interested and flattered by this opening. "I want you to set a new fashion. You know you can set almost any you choose in your own circle, for people are very like sheep, and will follow their leader if it happens to be one they fancy. I don't ask you to be a de Staël and have a brilliant salon. I only want you to provide employment and pleasure for others like yourself, who now are dying of frivolity or ennui." "I should love to do that if I could. Tell me how." "Well, dear, I want you to make Harry's home as beautiful and attractive as you can, to keep all the elegance and refinement of former times, and to add to it a new charm by setting the fashion of common sense. Invite all the old friends, and as many new ones as you choose, but have it understood that they are to come as intelligent men and women, not as pleasure-hunting beaux and belles. Give them conversation instead of gossip, less food for the body and more for the mind, the healthy stimulus of the nobler pleasures they can command, instead of the harmful excitements of present dissipation. In short, show them the sort of society we need more of, and might so easily have if those who possess the means of culture cared for the best sort, and took pride in acquiring it. Do you understand, Bella?" "Yes, but it's a great undertaking, and you could do it better than I." "Bless you, no. I haven't a single qualification for it but the will to have it done. I'm strong-minded, a radical, and a reformer. I've done all sorts of dreadful things to get my living, and I have neither youth, beauty, talent, or position to back me up, so I should only be politely ignored if I tried the experiment myself. I don't want you to break out and announce your purpose with a flourish, or try to reform society at large, but I do want you to devote yourself and your advantages to quietly insinuating a better state of things into one little circle. The very fact of your own want, your own weariness, proves how much such a reform is needed. There are so many fine young women longing for something to fill up the empty places that come when the first flush of youth is over, and the serious side of life appears. So many promising young men learning to conceal or condemn the high ideals and the noble purposes they started with, because they find no welcome for them. You might help both by simply creating a purer atmosphere for them to breathe, sunshine to foster instead of frost to nip their good aspirations, and so, even if you planted no seed, you might encourage a timid sprout or two that would one day be a lovely flower or a grand tree all would admire and enjoy." As Christie ended with the figure suggested by her favourite work, Bella said after a thoughtful pause, "But few of the women I know can talk about anything but servants, dress, and gossip. Here and there one knows something of music, art, or literature, but the superior ones are not favourites with the larger class of gentlemen. Then let the superior woman cultivate the smaller class of men who do admire intelligence as well as beauty. There are plenty of them, and you had better introduce a few as samples, though their coats may not be of the finest broadcloth, nor their fathers solid men. Women lead in society, and when men find that they can not only dress with taste, but talk with sense, the lords of creation will be glad to drop mere twaddle and converse as with their equals. Bless my heart!" cried Christie, walking about the room as if she had mounted her hobby and was off for a canter. "How people can go on in such an idiotic fashion passes my understanding. Why keep up an endless clatter about gowns and dinners, your neighbours' affairs, and your own aches, when there is a world full of grand questions to settle, lovely things to see, wise things to study, and noble things to imitate? Bella, you must try the experiment, and be the queen of a better society than any you can reign over now. It looks inviting, and I will try it with you to help me. I know Harry would like it, and I'll get him to recommend it to his patients. If he is as successful here as elsewhere, they will swallow any dose he orders, for he knows how to manage people wonderfully well. He prescribed a silk dress to a despondent, dowdy patient once, telling her the electricity of silk was good for her nerves. She obeyed, and when well dressed felt so much better than she bestirred herself generally, and recovered. But to this day she sings the praises of Dr. Carroll's electric cure. Bella was laughing gaily as she spoke, and so was Christie as she replied: "That's just what I want you to do with your patients. Dress up their minds in their best, get them out into the air, and cure their ills by the magnetism of more active, earnest lives." They talked over the new plan with increasing interest, for Christie did not mean that Bella should be one of the brilliant women who shine for a little while and then go out like a firework, and Bella felt as if she had found something to do in her own sphere, a sort of charity she was fitted for, and with it a pleasant sense of power to give it zest. When Letty and her mother came in, they found a much happier looking guest than the one Christie had welcomed an hour before. Scarcely had she introduced them when voices in the lane made all look up to see old Hepsy and Mrs. Wilkins approaching. "Two more of my dear friends, Bella, a fugitive slave and a laundress. One has saved scores of her own people, and is my pet heroine. The other has the bravest, cheeriest soul I know, and is my private oracle." The words were hardly out of Christie's mouth when in they came, Hepsy's black face shining with affection, and Mrs. Wilkins, as usual, running over with kind words. "My dear critter, the best of wishes and no end of happy birthdays. There's a trifling keepsake. Tuck it away, and look at it by me by. Miss Sterling, I'm proper glad to see you looking so well. Aunt Letty, how's that darling child? I ain't the pleasure of your acquaintance, miss, but I'm pleased to see you. The children all sent love, likewise Lisha, whose bones is better since I tried the campfire and red flannel." Then they settled down like a flock of birds of various plumage and power of song, but all amicably disposed, and ready to peck socially on any topic which might turn up. Mrs. Wilkins started one by exclaiming as she laid off her bonnet, "Sakes alive! There's a new picture. Ain't it beautiful? Colonel Fletcher brought it this morning. A great artist painted it for him, and he gave it to me in a way that added much to its value," answered Christie, with both gratitude and affection in her face, for she was a woman who could change a lover to a friend, and keep him all her life. It was a quaint and lovely picture of Mr. Greatheart, leading the fugitives from the city of destruction. A dark wood lay behind, a wide river rolled before. Mercy and Christiana pressed close to their faithful guide, who went down the rough and narrow path, bearing a cross-hilted sword in his right hand, and holding a sleeping baby with the left. The sun was just rising, and a long ray made a bright path athwart the river, turned Greatheart's dinted armour to gold, and shone into the brave and tender face that seemed to look beyond the sunrise. "There's just a hint of Davy in it that is very comforting to me," said Mrs. Sterling, as she laid her old hands softly together, and looked up with her devout eyes full of love. "Dem women oughter been black," murmured Hepsy, tearfully, for she considered David worthy of a place with old John Brown and Colonel Shaw. "The child looks like Pansy, we all think," added Letty, as the little girl brought her nosegay for Auntie to tie up prettily. Christie said nothing, because she felt too much, and Bella was also silent because she knew too little. But Mrs. Wilkins, with her kindly tact, changed the subject before it grew painful, and asked with sudden interest, "When be you going to hold forth again, Christie? Just let me know beforehand, and I'll wear my old gloves. I tore my best ones all to rags clappin' of you, it was so extra good." "I don't deserve any credit for the speech, because it spoke itself, and I couldn't help it. I had no thought of such a thing till it came over me all at once, and I was up before I knew it. I'm truly glad you liked it, but I shall never make another, unless you think I'd better. You know I always ask your advice, and what is more remarkable, usually take it," said Christie, glad to consult her oracle. "Hadn't you better rest a little before you begin any new task, my daughter? You have done so much these last years, you must be tired," interrupted Mrs. Sterling, with a look of tender anxiety. "You know I work for two, mother," answered Christie, with the clear, sweet expression her face always wore when she spoke of David. "I am not tired yet. I hope I never shall be, for without my work I should fall into despair or ennui. There is so much to be done, and it is so delightful to help do it, that I never mean to fold my hands till they are useless. I owe all I can do for in labour, and the efforts and experiences that grew out of it. I have found independence, education, happiness, and religion." "Then, my dear, you are ready to help other folks into the same blessed state, and it's your duty to do it," cried Mrs. Wilkins, her keen eyes full of sympathy and commendation as they rested on Christie's cheerful, earnest face. "If the spirit moves you to speak, up and do it without no misgivings. I think it was a special leading that night, and I hope you follow, for it ain't everyone that can make folks laugh and cry with a few plain words that go right to a body's heart, and stop there real comfortable and filling. I guess this is your job, my dear, and you'd better catch hold and give it the right turn." for it's going to take time, and women ain't stood alone for so long they'll need a sight of boosting." There was a general laugh at the close of Mrs. Wilkins's remarks, but Christie answered seriously, "I accept the task, and will do my share faithfully with words or work, as shall seem best. We all need much preparation for the good time that is coming to us, and can get it best by trying to know and help, love and educate one another as we do here." With an impulsive gesture, Christie stretched her hands to the friends about her, and with one accord they laid theirs on hers, a loving league of sisters, old and young, black and white, rich and poor, each ready to do her part to hasten the coming of the happy end. "Me too," cried little Ruth, and spread her chubby hand above the rest, a hopeful omen, seeming to promise that the coming generation of women will not only receive but deserve their liberty, by learning that the greatest of God's gifts to us is the privilege of sharing His great work. Each ready to do her part to hasten the coming of the happy end. End of chapter 20. End of Work, a Story of Experience by Louisa May Alcott.